Story 1. This happened in 2019 when I was 21. I was spending the summer at my parents' place and decided, on a whim, to camp out in the woods behind their house for a night. I'd done this kind of thing before, so it wasn't some big planned trip, just an impulsive idea I wanted to enjoy while I could. I told my parents where I was headed and left around 4 p.m. to find a spot. After walking for about an hour, I found a small clearing that looked perfect. I set up my tent, cleared a little area, and started a small campfire. It felt cozy, exactly the kind of evening I'd been picturing as the sun sank lower between the trees. Not long after, though, things got interrupted. Just as the sun was slipping past the treetops, I heard a voice, a man talking, sort of muttering. It sounded a bit echo-y, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The woods were getting dark, and shadows made it hard to see anything. I should say the woods behind my parents' house are large and mostly unexplored, no trails, so chances of running into someone were pretty slim. I figured whoever it was would pass by, and that would be the end of it. But the voice kept going for maybe 5 minutes, which made it feel like they weren't just walking past. It felt like they were lingering near me. I called out, a simple hello, but the moment I started, the voice stopped cold. The forest fell silent. That made me uneasy, so I called out again. Nothing. With only 20 or 30 minutes of daylight left, I decided to move. Better to find another spot than spend a creepy night. I went back into the trees looking for a new campsite, but after about 15 minutes, with sunlight fading fast, I gave up and settled among the trees where I was. It was the right call. By the time I finished getting things set up, it was fully dark and the woods were quiet. The stillness actually felt calming. I reasoned that if whoever had been out there returned, I'd hear them. I built a small fire, grabbed my snacks, and made s'mores. Roasting marshmallows over a campfire is one of my favorite things. It took my mind off everything. I sat by the fire for a long time, enjoying the warmth and the snack. Eventually, it was late and the fire was burning low. The light was down to about half of what it had been when I heard leaves crunching behind me. I thought at first it was somewhere to the back left of the campsite. When I turned my head, whatever it was stopped moving. I called out again, not expecting much after how the earlier attempt went. A few moments later, a man stepped out of the woods into the firelight. He startled me because he came from a different direction than where I'd heard the crunch. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said with a smile, and casually sat by the fire, holding his hands up to warm them. He behaved as if he belonged there, or as if he knew me. Can I help you?" I asked. He answered with a flat, "No." I couldn't tell if he was refusing help or saying I was in the wrong place. There was an awkward silence as we both sat there. Tension built until I blurted out, probably a mistake, "Were you the one talking near my other campsite earlier?" He kept his gaze on the fire, and his expression fell. "Must have been someone else," he said, his voice suddenly cold and monotone. Something was seriously off, but I didn't want to escalate a situation without reason. Before I could decide what to do, a stick cracked behind me from that same back left area. My stomach dropped. He wasn't alone. I turned to look at the man by the fire. He was looking straight at me. I don't remember if he was smiling or frowning. What stuck with me was the dead, cold look in his eyes. I sprang up and ran. One of the men called something in frustration, clearly talking to the other, and I heard footsteps behind me for a short stretch. I pushed as fast as I could into the dark woods, and because I'd grown up around there, I could still navigate enough to find the road and get back to my parents' house. They called 911. In the morning, I led officers to the campsite. Everything was gone. That fact is weirdly ambiguous. On one hand, maybe they were only there to rob me. On the other, their leaving meant they hadn't simply been passing through. They'd been up to something, and one of them had chased me for a bit. Either way, They clearly weren't harmless. Needless to say, I never went back into those woods behind my parents' house. Story 2. It happened in the thick of summer. I've always loved backpacking and camping, so when a friend told me you could rent old fire lookouts, I was intrigued. These were decommissioned lookout stations, typically miles from anywhere, buried in forest, and the idea of staying in one felt perfect. I picked what looked like the most remote one I could find. It had plenty of open dates through the season, which I liked, and the single photo available was ancient and fuzzy. I honestly had no idea what I was walking into. I knew it dated from the 1950s, and that it was old, but how much had been fixed up? No clue. I packed my usual gear and started the trail at 9 a.m. For the first several hours, there wasn't much to see. The terrain was thick and unforgiving, the so-called trail reduced to a rough path. After 5 hours, I finally glimpsed the lookout, a little structure perched on a distant ridge. It didn't look like the high stilts you sometimes see in pictures. More like a small cabin raised maybe 10 to 15 feet. An hour later, I was at the base. The hike had been brutal, but the view made it worth it. From the platform, it felt like you could see forever. The lookout itself was in rough shape, clearly aged, with a few patched areas here and there. A wraparound walkway circled the building, reached by a set of about 20 steps. Inside, it was empty. It wasn't glamorous, but for that view, I'd take simple over luxury any day. With daylight slipping away, I dropped my pack, cooked a quick meal, and lounged on the outer ledge. The place was quiet, wind and birds, and a deep wood silence. I was beat from the hike, so when the sun dipped, I unrolled my sleeping gear on the wooden floorboards and tried to sleep. Around 8 p.m., after maybe 30 to 40 minutes of trying to fall asleep, I heard something outside. Before I could move, the stairs creaked, footsteps coming up. I threw myself out of my sleeping bag and toward the door. A man rounded the corner a few seconds later. He looked to be in his late 40s, with longish blonde hair. He wasn't startled at all, almost as if he expected to find someone. "Great place to stay a few nights, isn't it?" he said, smiling and stepping closer. I replied, nervous, and mentioned I'd rented it for 3 nights. It felt strange having someone else there. Nothing else was around for miles, so I asked where he was camping. "Actually, I was hoping to stay here tonight," he said with that same grin. I awkwardly said sorry, and lying, told him a friend was just minutes away, and I couldn't host anyone else. His grin faded. He hesitated, nodded, and started to leave. When he headed down the stairs, I noticed something odd. He had no pack, no gear. Who shows up in such a remote place without supplies? I felt unsettled. I stayed up a little longer watching the tree line, but eventually sleep claimed me. Morning found me making coffee and soaking in the view, feeling a lot better. As I headed down, though, I saw a scrap of paper pinned to the railing at the bottom of the stairs. It simply said sorry with a smiley face. My first thought was it must have been from him, which meant he'd returned in the night while I slept. That realization put a knot in my stomach. I went for a walk partly to get fresh air and partly to look for signs of a campsite. The forest was mostly the same dense, unmoving green. I didn't see any tents, ear, or footprints. I went back to the lookout and spent the day there, enjoying the quiet and staying up later than the night before. Around midnight, I finally started packing for bed. I hung my small battery lantern from a nail on the wall and, feeling uncomfortable, stepped down off the platform to take a leak before I slept. Just at the edge of the trees, something moved. A shadow slipped out of the dim circle cast by the lantern. I froze and then raised the light to see better, but I couldn't make anything out. That silence after I called out was bone-chilling. I bolted back up to the lookout as fast as I could, only to feel even more exposed inside. All the walls were windows, and the door didn't lock. Leaving felt worse than staying. The trail at night was barely there. I kept the lantern lit and stared out into the dark, thinking about how anyone out there could see me clearly through my windows. I concentrated on watching the base of the stairs. The more I waited, the heavier the unease grew. I decided to pack anyway. At least if I needed to run, my bag would be ready. I kept stuffing things, then moving to the windows every 30 seconds to check the stairs. When I finally glanced down, a man stood at the first step. He was motionless, staring up as if waiting. It had to be the same man. Similar build, same lack of gear. Fear flooded me. Why was he back? Why stand there and not move? After a couple minutes, he took a few steps backward, paused, and walked away into the darkness. The walkway blocked my view of the direction he took, so I lost sight of him. My gut told me he'd been watching me, and I didn't want to test how far that went. I waited only a few minutes, grabbed my pack, and slipped down the stairs into the forest. I kept a pocket knife in my hand the whole way, hearts pounding with every snap of a twig. The trail disappeared into rougher terrain after about 15 minutes, so I switched on the lantern and pushed on, praying he wasn't following. The next 5 hours felt endless and paranoid. Dawn finally came, and with it, the relief of being able to find the path and make my way out. Even now, thinking back, it's hard to explain how terrifying those nights were. Something about that man didn't sit right. His repeated appearances, the note, his lack of gear. I told him I'd be there for 3 nights. That should have been no reason for him to return multiple times. If I'd stayed the full term, I keep imagining how much worse it could have been. Story 3. I was driving from northern Montana all the way up to Alaska. I had converted my SUV into a camping setup and spent 2 months living and camping out of it, with the primary aim of running the length of the Alaska Highway. That route was famous for a reason. It cuts through western Canada and is notoriously desolate and rough. I knew that ahead of time, so I prepared as thoroughly as I could for the trip. Of everything that could make me nervous, one thing left me feeling particularly exposed. Because I had to cross into Canada, I couldn't bring a firearm with me. Normally, I kept a gun tucked under my seat as a last resort protection, but this time I wasn't allowed to. Still, the first day went fine. I managed a solid 8 hours of driving. Most of that stretch was a touch less remote than what lay ahead. The next stretch only had gas roughly every couple 100 miles, so I had to stop and top up whenever possible and be careful with the way I drove. By sundown, I was nearly ready to collapse. I pulled off at the first campsite I found. Along the road, there were rest areas now and again, but mostly there were small trails leading to empty, wooded camping spots. Those were the spots I preferred. Because it was late, I didn't really take in the site I pulled into. It looked like nothing but trees in every direction, and no one else was around, so I put up my window shades, crawled into the back, and slept until morning. Everything seemed fine. I slept well through the night. Before hitting the road again, I wanted to stretch my legs with a short walk. Right as I stepped out, I spotted a trail and decided to follow it. It wasn't very long. I probably walked 5 minutes and came to another campsite, but something felt off. It looked scrappy and rough. Clearly someone had been there recently and seemed to have left in a rush. Half their gear was gone, and the rest was torn up and scattered around the clearing. After maybe 30 seconds, I turned and headed back. I didn't know if anyone was still nearby, but I trusted my gut and went back to the car. When I returned, there was now a truck parked right next to my vehicle. It was an all-black pickup with tinted windows. No one was outside, so I assumed someone was inside watching me as I approached and climbed in. With the weird campsite and the sudden truck nearby on such an isolated forest road, I left immediately. I didn't even debate it. Getting out of there fast was the clear choice. I drove 3 or 4 hours straight after that until I reached the next gas station. I pulled in. The station looked ancient and had a single double-sided pump. There was nobody else around. I got out and began pumping gas. The views were incredible, mountains all around, so I didn't mind waiting for the slow pump. After a few minutes, a truck rolled down the road. As it neared, I was almost certain it was the same black truck from the campsite. My stomach dropped when they pulled into the station and parked at the opposite side of the pump. It made sense they'd be stopping for fuel. You kind of had to on that road, but it still felt strange. Why would they have pulled into the campsite only to hang around briefly and leave just after I had? Thankfully, I finished in 30 seconds and drove off. Part of what felt off was that I never actually saw the man. He never got out or revealed himself, which made it even stranger. Still, it was reassuring that my tank was full. I'd be driving for a long stretch, putting distance between us and enjoying the scenery. I hoped I'd get ahead enough to find a daytime campsite instead of pulling in blind like the night before. I drove for a long while until the sun started to fall, then found a decent spot to pull off. The spot felt hidden, the trail tucked into brush, and there were no signs anyone had been there recently. It wasn't a popular site. I felt much safer than before. I really wanted to pitch my tent. It was far more spacious than sleeping cramped in the back of the SUV, but something told me not to, just in case. So I cooked outside, enjoyed the surroundings until sundown, then got back in the car. The next day would hopefully be shorter than the last two, so I stayed up watching downloaded videos on my phone. I stayed awake for probably 4 hours. I felt comfortable and was excited to be arriving in Alaska the next morning. Around 11 p.m., I heard something outside the car. Even after a second, I was certain it was a person walking. Dry leaves and twigs made it distinct. The crunch of dry sticks and leaves made it unmistakable. I put my phone down and sat up to look out the window, but I was beaten to it. A man's face was pressed against the side window, staring in. I could scarcely make him out, but there was no mistake about it. I jolted back, losing my breath from the surge of fear. They stepped back, vanishing into the darkness beyond the window. I leapt to the front seat and saw the second guy I'd heard running toward the car. He smashed the rear window just as I reached the front. Adrenaline made it hard to fumble my keys and start the engine. Part of it was also glancing back to see what the men were doing. One man ran to the driver's window while the other stuck an arm through the broken rear window, trying to open the door from inside. In the panic, I somehow got the keys into the ignition and turned them as he pried the back door open. I floored it. As I sped away, I passed the same black truck parked off the path, half hidden in the bush. They had followed me that far. I drove roughly a mile, then pulled over to close the still hanging back door and call the police with the scant cell service available. Out in the middle of nowhere, it took ages to connect, and the men were likely gone. I didn't get a plate, and it was too dark to see faces, so it was a lost cause. Despite the terrifying incident, I still made it to Alaska and enjoyed the rest of my trip after fixing the window. What those men intended by breaking into a car in the woods at night while I was inside is left to speculation. I prefer not to think about it. The memory of that night lingered long after I reached Alaska. I replayed the crunch of leaves and the flash of a face at my window. I kept checking my surroundings and made sure every door was locked, even though the roads felt empty by day. I felt a mix of anger and vulnerability. Anger that someone would do that, and vulnerable because the isolation that drew me there also made me exposed. I also regretted the small choice not to pitch my tent. A tiny decision suddenly looms large. But I refused to let the incident ruin the trip. I tightened my routines, locking doors, parking in visible spots, and choosing campsites closer to other people when possible. Meeting other travelers and swapping stories helped calm me down. Reaching Alaska felt like a relief, and the vast scenery helped put the fear into perspective. Repairing the broken window cost time and money, yet fixing it felt like taking back control. It taught me that you can recover from a terrible moment and still enjoy what you came for. I now avoid the most isolated spots when I can and take border rules seriously, but I still travel. More than anything, the trip taught me to respect both the beauty and the risks of remote roads, and to listen to that quiet voice that tells you when something is wrong. I kept the memory close as a cautionary tale, one that sharpened my instincts and changed how I travel without stealing my love for the road. Now,